Nobody tells you that the words you've been saying your whole adult life, words that felt honest, words that felt loving, words that felt like the natural thing a parent says, start landing differently once you cross into your 70s. They land in ways you didn't intend and couldn't have predicted. And by the time you notice the damage, some of it is already done in ways that take years to quietly repair. I learned this the hard way. Not all at once, the way a good lesson would arrive, but piece by piece across a stretch of years that involved enough misread conversations, enough strained holiday dinners, enough phone calls that ended with a feeling I couldn't quite name, that I finally had to sit down and look honestly at my own patterns. And what I found surprised me. It wasn't that I had been saying terrible things. I hadn't. What I had been doing was saying certain kinds of things, things that felt natural and even virtuous from inside my perspective, that were creating problems I never saw coming. Today I want to share 5 of them with you, not as criticism, not as a list of failures, but as the kind of honest conversation I wish someone had had with me 10 years ago, before some of the distances in my own family had time to grow. Because the beautiful thing, and I say this from experience, is that once you see these patterns clearly, they are not that hard to change. The relationships don't require rebuilding from the ground up. They just require a different kind of honesty than the one you've been using. Let me start with the one that took me the longest to recognize in myself. I want to be careful here because I know this one is tender. What I'm about to say does not mean your sacrifices weren't real. They were. Every one of them. The years you worked jobs that wore you down so the bills got paid. The things you gave up so your children could have what they needed. The ways you put your own wants on a shelf for so long that you forgot what they were. All of that is true. All of that matters. And there is nothing wrong with your children knowing in a general way that raising them cost you something real and that you gave it willingly. But there is a version of this that crosses a line, and most of us, if we are honest, have crossed it more than once. It is the version that arrives in the middle of a disagreement. The version that surfaces when a child makes a choice you don't like or doesn't do something you were hoping they would do. The version that sounds something like, "After everything I've done for you," or "I gave up so much so you could have this life," offered not as a memory, but as an argument, not as a sharing of history, but as a form of leverage. When the sacrifice is deployed that way, even once, something shifts in your child's relationship to their own gratitude. The gratitude that was real and free and theirs becomes complicated. It starts to feel like a debt, and debts create resentment in even the most loving people, because debt implies obligation, and obligation is the opposite of the free choice to love. I remember a conversation with my own daughter, years ago now, where I said something along those lines during a disagreement about a decision she had made about her own family. I thought I was being honest. I thought I was helping her understand the weight of what she was walking away from. What I was actually doing was handing her a burden she had never agreed to carry. She didn't say anything in the moment. She rarely did. But I noticed what happened to the temperature of the room, and I noticed that it took several months before our conversations felt easy again. The sacrifice was real. The love behind it was real. But the moment it became a bargaining chip, it stopped being a gift and became something else entirely. And your children feel that distinction even if they can never quite put words to it. What works instead is something simpler. Tell them the sacrifice once, clearly, from love, with no agenda attached. Tell them not when you need something from them, but when it's simply true and you want them to know it. Say it the way you'd say anything you simply want another person to understand about your life. And then leave it there. Let it be what it is. The gratitude that follows from that version is entirely different. It's the kind that lasts. This one has been breaking families apart for as long as families have existed, and yet somehow it keeps arriving in conversations like it's new information every time. I know parents who swear they never do this. I was one of them for a while, and then I started actually listening to myself during family conversations, and I heard it in forms I hadn't recognized as comparison because they were subtle enough to pass as something else. It doesn't always sound like your brother would have handled this differently. Sometimes it sounds like an observation, a neutral comment about one child dropped into a conversation with another. Sometimes it sounds like a question, an innocent wondering about why things went a certain way for one child and not another. Sometimes it sounds like pride, a little too loudly expressed about one child in the room where another child can hear it. The effect is always the same. The child on the receiving end of the comparison, whether they're 35 or 50 or 60 years old, feels something go tight in their chest. They feel themselves being measured. They feel the old arithmetic of family being run again, the calculation of who is more, who is less, who turned out better, who gave more, who needs more, who costs more. And here is the thing that parents in their 70s and 80s almost never fully reckon with. Your children are not children anymore. They are adults with full adult lives, with their own sense of self, their own achievements, their own complicated interior relationship with their own adequacy. When you compare them to a sibling, even gently, even without meaning to, you are not talking to a child who needs correcting. You are talking to a person who has spent 50 or 60 years building a self, and you are poking a hole in it. The damage accumulates. One comparison is small. 100 comparisons across decades is a pattern, and patterns become the story people tell themselves about who they are in relation to the people who were supposed to know them best. My son, the quieter of my two children, told me something a few years ago that I have not been able to forget. He said, "Dad, growing up, I always felt like I was being graded." He wasn't angry when he said it. He said it the way you say something you've made your peace with but still needed to release. And I sat there and I thought about all the casual comparisons I had made over the years, all the times I had held one child up next to the other without even fully realizing that's what I was doing, and I understood exactly what he meant. You can repair this. I repaired it. Imperfectly, but genuinely, by starting to speak about each of my children only in terms of who they specifically were. Not in relation to anyone else, just them. Their specific qualities, their specific life, their specific way of moving through the world. It takes a little practice because the comparative instinct runs deep. But the response when you stop comparing is immediate and unmistakable. People open up when they feel they are being seen as themselves rather than as a position in a ranking they never asked to be part of. Let me be direct about this one because I think directness is what it deserves. Your children's marriages are not your jurisdiction. I understand this may be uncomfortable to hear if you are watching one of your children in a marriage that worries you, or a marriage you simply don't prefer, or a marriage you have opinions about that feel reasonable and loving and grounded in genuine concern. I understand that watching your child make choices inside their most intimate relationship and being unable to do anything about it is one of the harder experiences of being a parent. But I want to tell you what happens when parents make their opinions about their children's marriages a regular feature of their relationship with those children. One of two things occurs. Either the child pulls away from the parent in order to protect the marriage, which is exactly what they should do, but which costs you the closeness, or the child allows the parent's opinion to create a wedge inside the marriage, which damages the one relationship in their life that should be their primary refuge, which is a damage you caused with your love, which is the worst kind of damage there is. I have watched both of these things happen in my own extended family. I have watched parents lose years of closeness with a child because they couldn't stop expressing concern about the person that child chose. I have watched marriages become quietly strained because one partner could feel that their in-law found them wanting, and I have watched the child in the middle of that situation age visibly under the weight of loving people on both sides who were asking them to choose. After 70, if you have concerns about your child's marriage, the only thing worth saying is something like, "I love you, and I'm here for whatever you need." That's the whole statement. That's the entire scope of what is helpful. Because here is what's true. If the marriage is good, your ongoing opinions are unwelcome noise. If the marriage is struggling, your child already knows that without your commentary, and what they need from you is a safe harbor, not a chorus of "I told you so" waiting in the background. And if the marriage fails, your child will need you to be the person who held their dignity intact, who never required them to feel ashamed of their choice, who was simply there without condition. That is the parent they will run toward when things get hard, the one who kept their opinions about the marriage to themselves and just kept the love steady and available. I had to learn this later than I should have. I had opinions and I expressed them and I thought I was helping. The relationships with my children and with the people they chose to build their lives with are better now than they were in those years. Not because the circumstances changed, because I stopped making my opinions part of the weather. This one, I think, comes from the most honest and painful place of any item on this list, because the longing underneath it is real. The wish to see them more, to hear from them more, to be more present in each other's daily lives. That is not a manipulation. That is love. That is the genuine ache of a parent who misses their child and doesn't quite know what to do with that. But the way it gets expressed, in so many families I have seen and in my own early patterns, transforms something that is love into something that functions like guilt. And guilt, as a tool for connection, has the worst return on investment of any tool I know. When you tell a child they don't call enough, what they hear underneath the words is "you are failing me." Even if that is not what you mean. Even if what you mean is simply "I miss you, I love you, I want more of you in my life." The version that arrives after decades of the parent-child dynamic, the version that lands in their chest, is a verdict about their adequacy as a child and a person. And the response to a verdict is almost never warmth. The response to a verdict is defense. They explain why they're busy. They feel guilty. They call more for a few weeks out of that guilt, and then the guilt fades and the pattern goes back to what it was. Except now there is an additional layer of low-level shame underneath every call they do make. A sense that they are never quite doing enough, never quite measuring up, that the phone when it rings is carrying a performance review. That is not the energy you want surrounding your relationship with your children. What works, and I mean this practically because I have seen it work in my own life, is replacing the complaint with an invitation. Not "you never come to see me," but "I've been thinking about you and I'd love to see your face." Not "you haven't called in 3 weeks, but I was sitting here this morning and I thought about that trip we took years ago and it made me want to call you." Not an accusation dressed in disappointment, but a genuine reaching toward. The difference in response is remarkable. An invitation opens something, a complaint closes it. And after 70, with however many years of close relationship you still have available to you, opening things is always the better choice. I have saved this one for last because I think it is the most complicated and the one that requires the most gentleness to talk about honestly. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging mortality. After 70, mortality is not a distant abstraction. It is a real presence in your life, something you think about, something you prepare for, something that shapes how you spend your time and what you say you value. Having honest conversations with your children about the practical realities of aging, about your wishes, about what matters to you, all of that is not only appropriate, it is loving and responsible. But there is a version of the mortality conversation that is none of those things. There is a version that surfaces not in the context of genuine planning or honest reflection, but in the middle of an argument, or when a child doesn't call, or when a holiday plan doesn't work out the way you hoped. A version that sounds like "I won't always be here," deployed as a reminder, as a weight, as a way of asking for something by invoking the most unanswerable pressure there is. When that happens, the conversation stops being about mortality and becomes about control, and your child knows the difference, even if they can't name it, even if they love you too much to say so directly. What it does to them is cruel in an unintentional way. It puts them in a position where every disappointment you express becomes loaded with the possibility of loss, where every time they don't do the thing you hoped they would do, They have to carry not just the ordinary friction of a disagreement, but the additional weight of what if that was the last time I had the chance to do it right. That weight is not love. That weight is a kind of emotional hostage-taking, and it damages the relationship in ways that can last long after the conversation is over. The genuine conversations about mortality, the ones your children will carry with them as gifts long after you are gone, are the ones that come from peace. The ones where you sit with them and say, "Here is what I want you to know about my life. Here is what I hope for you. Here is what mattered to me." Those conversations create closeness. They are among the most intimate things two people can share. But those conversations require that the subject of your death not have been weaponized first. They require that when you bring up the finite nature of your time together, the room fills with love rather than anxiety. And that is only possible if you have been disciplined enough in the years before that conversation to keep the subject clean. Protect the conversation. Keep it for when it deserves to happen fully, honestly, with nothing being asked in return. I want to sit with you here for a moment before we close, because I think underneath all 5 of these things, there is one thread, and I want to name it plainly. All 5 of them are things we say because we are afraid. The sacrifice reminder is fear that we won't be appreciated. The comparison is fear that we chose wrong in how we raised them, or that we'll lose one if we don't somehow make them each feel like the favorite. The opinions about the marriage are fear that our child will be hurt, and we won't be able to stop it. The complaint about not calling is fear of the loneliness and the shrinking world that comes with age. And the mortality reminder is fear of being forgotten, fear of not mattering enough while we're still here to know it. Every single one is fear wearing the clothing of love. And the reason it matters to name that is this: fear-based communication never builds the connection it's reaching for. It builds the opposite. It builds walls of obligation and guilt and careful distance. It turns love into performance and presence into management. What builds real connection at every age, but especially at this one, is love that has been freed from fear. Love that simply says what it means without asking for anything in return. Love that trusts the relationship enough to let it breathe, to let the other person come toward it freely rather than obligated toward it. You raised your children for decades. You put everything you had into the people they became. The relationship you have with them now is built on a foundation that is deeper and stronger than any single conversation or any single pattern you've developed. Which means it can also hold the honest work of changing some of those patterns, not perfectly, not overnight, but genuinely in the way that real things change. And the reward for doing that work, I can tell you from my own experience, is a kind of relationship with your grown children that the fear-based version was never going to give you. Something lighter, something freer. Something that feels, on both sides, like a choice made every day rather than an obligation carried across years. That is worth the work, every day of it. Thank you for spending this time with me today.